Cocaine overdoses in the United States are causing tens of thousands of deaths a year. According to official statistics, it jumped from about 4,000 deaths in 1999 to more than 24,000 in 2022, a 600% increase. Almost all of the cocaine consumed by Americans comes from South America via the Caribbean and the Mexican border. Cocaine production has tripled to a record 2,000 tons in 2023 compared to 25 years ago, but the United States has changed the focus of its counter-narcotics efforts.
President Miguel Diaz-Canel
and is looking to expand cooperation with regimes with a history of promoting drug trafficking.
NBC News exclusive about a rare partnership between the United States and Cuba.
According to a recent report by MSNBC, John Carter, head of security of the American Embassy in Havana, suggested cooperation with the Castro's regime is a matter of national security.
It's an area that is under the U.S. national security interests, then of course we want cooperation.
Another officer with the U.S. Coast Guard in Havana thinks anti-narcotics cooperation between Cuba and the U.S. should increase.
I do believe that these bilateral agreements should be expanded.
Both officials ignore the long history and the very recent cases of Havana's active participation in drug trafficking, especially cocaine, to the United States. Just 2 years after coming to power, Fidel and Raul Castro had already a plan to create drug trafficking networks to smuggle cocaine and other drugs as a weapon to weaken the U.S. The plan was revealed by Czech defector General Jančagina, who was the liaison between the Cuban intelligence and the Soviets and met Raul Castro between 1961 and 1968 to advance the drug trafficking strategies. When cocaine flooded the streets in Miami and other cities in the 1980s, Cuba was already actively helping out the Colombian drug traffickers. According to a 1982 indictment filed in the federal court in Miami, for high-ranking officers of the Cuban government worked with Colombian and American drug traffickers to smuggle into the U.S. $800 million worth of drugs, including cocaine, marijuana, and the very popular psychedelic pills known as Quaaludes. Among the officers accused were Vice Admiral Aldo Santamaria Cuadrado, a member of the Cuban Communist Party leadership, and the Cuban ambassador to Bogotá, Fernando Ravelo Renedo. None of them were ever tried for their crimes. In 1989, the Cuban regime staged a trial against top military commanders, including Arnaldo Ochoa and Tony de la Guardia, on drug trafficking charges. They were accused, among other crimes, of reportedly receiving more than $3 million in exchange for helping Pablo Escobar to smuggle tens of tons of cocaine into the U.S. But the trial had been ordered by Fidel Castro after he learned the U.S. government had compromising evidence of his direct involvement with the Medellin cartel. Fidel used de la Guardia and Ochoa as scapegoats to get himself out of trouble using lies and fake evidences. Ochoa was involved in the ivory trafficking, not narcotics, and de la Guardia was following Castro's orders. Both were condemned to the firing squads.
El intento de mezclar a Raúl en esta porquería. Eran unos hijos de puta.
In fact, both Fidel and Raúl Castro personally transformed Cuba as a drug superhighway into the U.S., as dozens of federal agents, Cuban defectors, and Colombian drug traffickers told U.S. Congress and federal courts.
And Cuba is now an emerging protection racket with respect to drugs.
Among the key witnesses there were 4 military and intelligence operatives that defected to the U.S. in 1987 and told what they knew about the Havana drug cartel. Few months after walking into the U.S. Embassy in Vienna, Chief Spy Florentino Aspriaga explained to his CIA handler that it would be impossible to smuggle cocaine through Cuba without the personal approval of the Castro brothers. Manuel de Beonza, another intelligence officer, said Fidel ordered him help to create hundreds of shell companies all over the world to launder proceeds from drug trafficking. He also had sensitive inside information about the Havana Cartel.
The Colombian drug traffickers would go to the south of Cuba, or through the northern part, with their boats. They would deliver the drugs to Cuban boats that were protected by the Cuban Coast Guard, or the Navy, and that drug, Cuba would be like a warehouse, and then the boatmen would come, enter through the Marina Hemingway or Varadero to pick it up, and bring it to Miami.
Air Force General Rafael Del Pino fled Cuba on board of a tiny Cessna 402 and landed in Key West, Florida with a trove of secrets. He was the most senior officer to defect from Cuba. He said he received orders from Raul Castro to help Colombian planes loaded with cocaine to navigate the Cuban airspace.
Several times I received orders from Raul Castro's office and also from General Abrantes' office to let the airplane cross over Cuba.
Counterintelligence officer Juan Antonio Rodriguez Menier said Fidel profited from drug trafficking to support an opulent lifestyle, including a mansion in Havana.
This cooperation is beneficial not only for Cuba and the United States.
The evidence against the Castro's involvement in drug trafficking was so overwhelming that the Department of Justice prepared an indictment against Raul Castro. The indictment was never filed for political reasons by the Clinton administration in 1993.
General Noriega is under indictment for drug-related charges.
But substantial evidence had already surfaced during the trial of Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega, and also in the groundbreaking 1991 PBS documentary entitled Cuba and Cocaine, that gathered for the first time all the allegations and witnesses of Cuba's involvement in drug trafficking.
Cocaine and marijuana has become a revolutionary weapon against American imperialism.
Carlos Leder, a key associate of Pablo Escobar who had been detained in 1987 on drug trafficking charges and sentenced to life in prison, became the most notorious witness against the Havana Cartel. Leder, who agreed to testify in the Noriega trial in 1991, said he negotiated with Raul Castro the use of Cayo Largo Sur in Cuba as a transshipment point for U.S.-bound cocaine. Leder revealed he donated a plane to Castro as part of the agreements. In exchange, Cuba would also help launder drug profits for the Medellin cartel. In 1999, the Havana Cartel increased its narco operations with the rise of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. As an investigation of Daily Beast revealed in 2018, Havana played a major role in the making of Venezuela as a mafia state. Cuba knew of the criminal activities of the well-known Cartel de los Soles, Cartel of the Suns, the Venezuelan military-led drug trafficking organization accused of sending hundreds of tons of cocaine to the U.S. Cuba facilitated some of the cartel's illegal activities, testified Limzy Salazar, a former Venezuelan presidential security chief who defected to the U.S. in 2015. Juan Reynaldo Sanchez, a deputy in Fidel Castro's security detail who escaped to Miami in 2008, provided pivotal testimony in this book.
In
1989, I overheard a conversation between Fidel Castro and the then Interior Minister. The minister was briefing Fidel in drug trafficking deals.
More recently, in 2018, a computer engineer who worked for the Venezuelan state oil company PDVSA and became a protected witness in a drug trafficking criminal investigation in Miami, provided evidence of Cuban involvement in narcotics alongside the Maduro regime.
Cubans provided security for the Havana Cartel.
The witness also testified that he traveled many times to Coco, in northern Cuba, in planes that came from Venezuela, loaded with cocaine and cash. The Cubans laundered the money and sent it to accounts to American financial institutions. When the accounts were subsequently seized, federal prosecutors found out more than $400 million in funds. The investigation is still ongoing. According to experts from the Center for a Free Cuba, anti-drug cooperation between Havana and Washington not only ignores the Havana Cartel's long history of supporting drug trafficking, it also helps the Castro dictatorship cover up the trafficking and money laundering that continues unabated today.